So it's great pleasure that CCVO has been hosting the HR in a Box series with the talent pool. Today's session is on competencies, critical skills, and transferability, and it is the last of our series. Well, maybe not. But I'll let Nicole have the thunder on that one. I would like to take a moment to introduce you to my partner in crime, Nicole Jelly, who is the Executive Director of the Talent Pool.
So thank you very much for being here today. You know what? This is fantastic. We've got a room filled to capacity, and I believe 20 waiting listees, over 20 waiting listees. So obviously we hit a nerve with this topic, and particularly with everything that's going on right now in the economy. So don't be surprised if all of a sudden there is another session on this particular topic, because I don't know how we're going to evolve from an economic perspective without this knowledge. So today we've got a really jam-packed, full of information session with experts that really understand what competencies, critical skills, and most importantly, transferability is all about. Janet Salopek, who has been with us for all this journey, and without whom, really, without your organization and yourself, I mean, this would not have taken off. So a year ago, Janet heard about this crazy idea and said, I'm in, and I can't begin to thank you enough. So Janet Salopek and Associates is very well known, not only in Calgary, but across Alberta and in Ontario. You have all heard about the HR program for not-for-profits. I only encourage you to continue to explore that option, because we can only do so much by ourselves.
So I want to get practical and talk about the competencies important to our sector and share some ideas with respect to what is the work you've done within your own organizations about competencies, what competencies are you calling out, and what ones are important, and share that with each other. And then we also wanted to be successful, we really need to further talk about that transition, about how are we going to attract talent to our organization in order to compete and to be successful in the 21st century. I heard a new word today. I was just saying to Jeff when I heard his talk on meta competencies. So I've always thought in terms of core competencies, but now I'm thinking even bigger with respect to meta competencies. So I need to reflect on that. And I really think as we think about meta competencies, it grows our thinking on core competencies, because it'll force us to think about transitioning through the whole universe with respect to what's important to organizations. And we need to think bigger than just the core within our organizations, what's important to our sector, what's important to other sectors, and call out and think about the consistencies that we might have with the private sector or the government sectors, and think in terms of bigger than just core to our organization. So it made me think, and I'd like to spend some time this morning talking about that at our tables as well. But when I entered the profession as an HR professional, a CEO said to me, Janet, one of your biggest jobs in our organization is to bring talent in and to develop talent. And so that was the beginning of a wonderful career around competencies, because what I had to learn how to do as I went into organizations was to get the feel for that organization and to identify what are the competencies that are critical and important to that organization, because I was continually looking for it, continually. Every time I went to a networking event, every time I spoke, I would always look for competencies that I thought might be good for our organization, and that would be the beginning of a potential relationship with talent and bringing that talent in. And now as I work with organizations, we do a lot of recruiting, both in the not-for-profit and the profit sector. And what's really important for us is getting to know those organizations and understanding the competencies that they look for, regardless of what position they're recruiting for. Because what's happening nowadays, when organizations are recruiting, they're recruiting for talent. They're recruiting for competencies. They're not particularly recruiting for a specific job. They're looking for a good match with respect to competencies. So it's just becoming so important strategically for us to be continually thinking and looking at competencies. So really, competencies are the building blocks. They're how we, the basis for recruitment. They're the basis for how we train people, how we'll do succession planning. But you know what? I really believe competencies also has a piece to play in our strategy. And actually sitting and listening today, I'm going to think about competencies now in terms of strategy. When I get together now with organizations, we should be not only thinking of mission, vision, values, we need to be thinking competencies, as well as our mission and vision. So now when I go into strategy sessions, I'm going to be bringing that component. And I think that's been a takeaway for me this morning, as I particularly listened to Jeff's presentation. I'm going to be encouraging our organizations to think in terms of competencies and building that into our culture about how we look out and how we are going to compete as we move forward. So it's not only going to be about those four things, it's also going to be about strategy. And really, if we allow ourselves to think in terms of strategy, in terms of strategic competencies, mega competencies, we're going to be able to continually look for those leadership skills and actually be in a better way to compete and deal with some of the environmental issues that we're having to deal with today. So let's just talk a little bit about what are those environmental challenges that we're having to face today. And because I really think if we pull back and think big picture, once we get into the discussion about what are the competencies that are important to us, it will give us more food for thought, and it might break some old paradigms that we have regarding competencies. So we need to think about what are our challenges. We've obviously got the economic. Every time you open the paper, you turn on the newspaper, you hear about the recession. But you know, it's kind of interesting because we work in both the corporate sector and the not-for-profit sector. And a year and a half ago, I would be sitting with a bunch of leaders in the private sector, and they'd be talking about how they couldn't possibly do business at less than a $60 a barrel oil. And now it's half that price. We would sit at the table with a bunch of not-for-profit leaders, and they were thinking, how can we possibly raise funds when it was $60 barrel oil, and now it's half of that? So that whole discussion around economics has really taught me that a competency that we need to be looking for is resiliency. If we're not resilient, how possibly can our leaders deal with an economy that's half of what we thought it was 2 years ago? Our demographics. Look what's happening in our demographics today. A couple of years ago, 5 years ago, probably we used to say, well, there's three or four generations in our workforce. Now we've got 4 or 5, and we've also got huge diversity. It's completely different, and it's changed within 2 or 3 years. So really, I mean, huge changes demographically that we're having to face here. So what does that tweak us with respect to what do we need to be thinking about in competencies and be able to cope with that, right? And also the social trends. Look at social media now. It's huge. I mean, we don't do anything without social media. And so again, what is it that's happening in our environment that's forcing us strategically to think, and what competencies do we need in order to compete at those levels? And that's how we're going to compete in the 21st century. So I really encourage you, as we go into some round tables and talk about competency, break old paradigms about, what do we look for in our leadership, in our organizations, and just think in terms of those environmental challenges that we have. Before we go into a conversation about core competencies, I just want to ask you to reflect. In your handouts, we've got some competencies defined for you. And we've also got some recruitment questions based on those core competencies. And I just would like to remind you, though, this is only a starting point. And I always encourage when we go into work with clients, we like to say that, we never like to start from a blank sheet of paper. It is actually good to have a starting point, but just use it as a starting point to say, how can we tweak these? How can we think big? How can we think in terms of those 3 environmental challenges that we have and grow this list? Break our thinking, but you don't have to necessarily start from a blank piece of paper. So as we go into a bit of a round table here, reflect on some of the things you might have in your handouts, but don't be afraid to think outside the box and think of truly unique things around competencies that are going to allow us to help us with some of those challenges, both on that economic, that demographic, and that social venue. So I'm going to put you to work, and I'd like you to go into your tables and talk about what are the core competencies in your organization and why are they important. So what are some of the things that you're looking at around competencies? And again, broaden your thinking in order to think about those 3 environmental challenges that if we're not thinking about competencies that address those, we're missing the boat. And share some ideas. And I'm going to just give you about maybe 5 minutes, and then we'll just share together. But maybe we could just share together what are some of the core competencies that you look for in your organization, and or maybe you've thought that you should look at now as you've done some reflection, particularly as we think in terms of the challenges that we have and will continue to have in the 21st century. So what were some of the competencies, core competencies? And remember, core being that regardless of the position in the organization, everybody must display these skills, abilities, and knowledge. And what I always like to say too is we've got to attach behaviors to that too. So everybody has to display these behaviors. So what were some of the things the competencies that you came up with that are core to your organization or should be core to your organization? Yes? Integrity, okay. Okay. What else? Yeah.
I don't quite know how to language it, but we're really shifting more to embracing a philanthropic attitude or into a philanthropic culture. So everybody you meet is a potential donor. So how do you work that? How do you own that as an employee?
Okay, so
it's almost like philanthropic attitude, I guess.
Okay. Everyone's a donor. Okay. What about, thank you for that. What are some other competencies that you're looking for or should be looking for?
Volunteer.
Pardon? Volunteer? Aptitude, like the whole idea about giving of your time, right?
Yeah, it's the
Okay.
volunteerism, attitude.
Okay. What else? Yes?
Well, that's it. Definitely the key thing is flexibility, because depending on the economic situations, whether you're a 12-year-old volunteer or a 9-year-old or staff, we all have to be super flexible.
Okay, flexibility. Okay.
And I think, Janet, that ties into your resiliency.
Resilience, okay.
That really spoke to me.
Okay. What else? Yes? Pardon? Resourcefulness. Okay, wow. All right. What else? Yes.
We talk about social media savvy. Everybody
Okay.
needs to be aware of what they put out there and how they do it both personally and also professionally.
Okay, great. Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Talk about the art of building relationships in order to develop people partnerships.
Okay. Anything else comes to mind? Yeah.
Caring and respect.
Caring and respect. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Is there anybody that's got a burning one that they want me to put up? Because what I'm going to encourage you to do as we do this, as you go, and this is an exercise that I really encourage you to take back to your organizations and work with them on this. Because what I'd really like you to do is challenge you to say, if these are our challenges on a go-forward basis, what's the cross-reference here? How will these competencies get us there at a level that we can compete? So continue the discussion back at your office, and challenge yourselves to find that link. Because what we know also is that, and I said I'm a pretty practical person, I always like to keep things top of mind. If you've got a huge laundry list of competencies, guess what? It's all watered down, right? So if you're thinking core competency in your organization, pick 4 or 5 that are critical. Like these are the most important thing. Talk about them, continually look for them, and make it part of who you are. And the way to do that is to take what are our challenges and how are these competencies gonna get us there. So take that exercise, take it back to your teams back at the office, and continue to work those. And the other thing I'd like to think before I leave this slide too is there's a difference, and we heard it earlier, there's a difference between mega competencies, your core competencies, job-specific competencies, and occupational competencies. So think about that, right? The takeaway I had when I heard Jeff was I'm going to start thinking more about occupational competencies, as opposed to job-specific competencies, because I think it helps me think broader. I'm still going to think about mega competencies and core competencies specifically as I talk to organizations about what's really, really important relative to their industry, to your sector, to your business in order to compete. But occupational competencies in terms of job specific, right? And so make sure that we're thinking in terms of both. And we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the job specific or the occupational specific in a little while. But I want to give us a few more, one or two more slides to give us some additional food for thought. So in our sector, we kind of are unique and facing some unique challenges that will bode well for us to think about as we think in terms of our competencies, right? So we need to reflect on these. And that's why I'm saying I'm a strategist, but I'm pretty practical. I like to think the bigger picture, what's happening out there, what are we facing with, and I like to drill it down and say, okay, what does that mean to us with respect to competencies? So we're all competing for the same limited pool of funds, right? And I had a conversation as I came into the room today about the uniqueness of a particular organization. Housing for Humanity, sorry. Who was I speaking to? Yes, yeah. Sorry, I've forgotten your name. Brenda. And you made a comment to me that really resonated here, and you're saying, we're different, right? We found our own niche. And that is so critical for us to find our own niche because we're all applying to the same funders. We're all approaching many of the same donors, right? So what is our niche? And what are the competencies in our people that we need to foster in order for us to understand what is our niche? What competencies, are within us that allow us to realize this and reflect on that. And so what type of people do we need in our organizations that get that? that get that, because honestly, not everybody gets that. So what is it that we're looking for? That's a competency in order for us to understand our niche, because the funders want us to pay attention to our niche. What processes and what do we need to be thinking about developing processes to engage our donors? It's not, donors are different nowadays than they were 5 years ago. Donors are not just groups of organizations that give us money or a foundation that gives us money. Donors are people. Donors are the everyday person on the street who gets it with respect to our story, right? So what do we need to be looking at as far as competencies in order to attract people to our organization that get that? Transparency and accountability is huge right now, and I mean, a lot of our funders are funding us to become more transparent, to look at our governance processes and our governance structures, right? So again, what competencies do we need to be looking at to ensure that our leaders in our organization understand that and can build processes within their organizations to allow them to be transparent, and also competencies within our leaders that allow them to work effectively with their boards. What kind of competencies does that take? We need to bring competencies into our organization who understand management systems, who can measure, who can look out throughout the organization and be able to get fairly quickly, without a lot of rigmarole or a lot of money or a lot of expense, a good feel for the organization, right? About their people. So what kind of competencies do we need to be looking for in order to be able to very quickly develop a scorecard for our organization to say, how healthy are we? What are the competencies that it takes to do that? And competencies too, and this goes back to the funding, right? How do we get our money? How do we get our money? It's about foundation endowments, and what type of competencies do we need to be bringing into our organization so that we can get after that type of money. It seems everybody is looking for fundraisers now, right? If you go on, everybody seems to be looking for a fundraising person, right? So have we really given enough thought to what are the competencies in order to bring that talent in? And where do we have to look? And I don't have the answer, but I know the answer's in this room among all of us if we talk about it. Where do we have to look other than traditional grounds to bring that in? Or do we have to bring it in? Maybe we outsource it. But what we need to break old paradigms and old ways of thinking in order to crack that challenge. When we look at our strategic challenges, I like the fact that, and there's been a lot of research on this, it's almost like a balanced scorecard, right? We look at 4 areas of our organization. We look at the financial, competitiveness, the operational effectiveness, and the talent. So when you're thinking about developing competencies, again, map it. What competencies are we bringing in to make sure that we can be financially strong, that we can be competitive, that we can compete operationally? Who's good at measurement within our organization? What does that have to look like as with respect to competencies? And then who is good and what talent do we need to be bringing in on the people side of things? And I'd like to encourage you to think that when we bring talent into our organization, they kind of need to be strong in all 4 of these areas. Gone are the days where we can bring specialists in, and yep, that's our financial guy, or that's our financial woman. Even our financial people have to be strong on the people side of things. And that's the same with our people. When you bring in an HR person, they can no longer just be strong on the people side of our business. They have to get it with respect to finances. So when we're looking at talent and bringing them in, regardless of the occupation that we bring them into, regardless of the position, they're going to need to be strong in all 4 of those areas. So think about that in terms of competencies and the talent that you look for as you hire for any particular position in your organization. So think big, think broader. So I think I've said enough with respect to our challenges. I do want to emphasize the fact, though, that as we look at competencies and we look at, because I'm now going to ask you to start thinking about occupational job-specific competencies, think in terms of strategic leadership, finance and fundraising, and partnership development. And as you look at occupations within your organization, what competencies do you need to be focusing on in order to make sure that for key positions in your organizations, you're covering off of these 3 areas because they're going to be critical and key for all of your key positions that you will recruit for in your organizations. You can't afford not to pay attention to this in every key position within your organization. And what I'm going to do is put you back to work and talk about the job-specific competencies required for leaders in your organization. And a leader is not just your executive director. It's every key and critical position. That might be a program developer. That may be a receptionist at the front desk. What position is key? What's the relevancy of these 3 leadership areas? And what competencies will you look at for the occupational or job-specific positions in your department that are key? So we'll have that discussion now. And how are they different from maybe some of the core competencies that you've identified? And I'll give you about 5 minutes. Okay, I'll just have everybody regroup. So I'd like to sort of share some of the thinking that we had at the table, because I truly believe when we come to events like this, the opportunity to learn from each other is huge. And I honestly also believe that the answers are never with the consultant, they're always with the people in the room. So we need to hear from each other. So what I'd like to do is hear some of your thoughts on these occupational or job-specific competencies that you might look for. But again, I really would like to emphasize the thought processes that we do when we do this, right? Because it's the thought process that I'd like you to take back to your organization and continue to work it, right? So when we think of core competencies, that's competencies that are held by everybody in the organization, regardless of their position. We're going to try to map it to our environmental changes because everybody in the organization needs to be aware of what's going on around them, and they need to be competent enough to address them. When we come to occupational or job specific, I'd like to work the leadership skills. So these are the key and critical positions in your organizations, and what are the competencies that you need to see from those positions, those occupations, in order for you to be strategic, financially well-positioned, and always focused on partnerships. So what did you come up with respect to competencies? You had great conversation, but no decisions are made, right? What were some of the, yes? Teamwork, okay. And sorry? Communication, okay. Okay. What other ones? In order to be strategic, financial, with a focus on partnership. What are some other competencies? You need to be strategic, okay. Yep. Change management. Adaptable. Okay. What about good business acumen? Okay. Right. Okay. Right. Anything else that came to mind? Yep. Doesn't hurt to call it out. Okay, anything else that comes to mind? We just went through, we're working with an organization right now, and I have to tell this story because to your question this morning, I thought it was a good one. Sorry, your name was? Bobby. Like, how do we look for these competencies, bring those competencies into the organization, realizing, though, that they do have a job to do, right? And so if we sort of don't set the parameters and or the guidelines, they kind of can run amok, right? And then how do you keep them focused, particularly with our millennials coming into the workforce, right? Because we all know our millennials, oh my God, they want to run the world the minute they step in the front door. Now, nothing wrong with that. That's great. And I mean, we recruit for that. We recruit for that, right? Like, we want that, but we also have to build some parameters because, you know, they need to learn our organization and the way we do things and all that sort of thing. So we're doing some work right now with this organization, and they have done a great job, I think, of doing that. And I've worked with this group for, well, probably as long as I've been in business, in my own business, throughout 10 years, right? And I've seen such a huge shift in the competencies that they've brought into their organization and the look and feel of who's there now versus who was there 10 years ago. And so they have brought in a number of our millennials. Well, millennials make up most of our work site right now anyways, percentage-wise. But they have brought in these very keen, great thinking people with wonderful ideas, put them into positions, so they have, you know, brought them in and brought them because of what they bring to the organization. But they've challenged it. They've channeled it in that they say, okay, but you know, you have a job to do, so here's your job. They very much focus on goals and outcomes, right? So not specific about the job. To Jeff's point here, let's not just focus on the job. We're going to focus more on outcomes. So these are the goals and the outcomes of what you're responsible as you come into our organization. But what they've also done is they've put them on multidisciplinary teams. And that has created opportunities for these people who have come in with great ideas to actually apply them to different aspects of the organization. And so the piece of work that we were doing with them was we were rehauling their performance review process, like completely rehauling it. And they wanted to completely do something different. So they put a multidisciplinary team on this particular project. So we had managers, we had frontline staff, all on a working committee to do this complete rehaul, right? And so that is how they're utilizing that talent into the organization to do great work in there, right? So they are expecting them to do the job that they're hired to do, but they're also giving them great opportunities to apply some out-of-the-box thinking to do some wonderful things for their organization. So that's I think, how we have to integrate that generation, those competencies, with still getting our work done, focusing on what are your, you know, goals and objectives, but then giving them great opportunities to work in some multidisciplinary teams, like cross-organization. How many people here do projects that are multidisciplinary? You do working committees, right? And how does that work for you guys? Like, what is your experiences? Mm-hmm.
People are all willing to sort of get together. Sometimes what we find is that personalities will lead it in certain directions.
Right.
But for the most part, we come up with some great solutions.
Right, so facilitation, like a competency that's around facilitation is really important then if you're going to do that, because otherwise they could run amok, right? They could still run amok. And really being clear on deliverables even when you do that, right? Because people will grasp at those opportunities because they are those out-of-box thinkers. But again, you've got to harness it being clear on what is expected of you. These are the outcomes. But again, something to think about as you bring in some of these competencies and want to put them to work, but still there's a job to be done. What we've got here then, and what the thought I'd like to leave you here is, again, this mapping that you're going to do with respect to your occupational and then your leadership skills. Start here and say, you know, if this is important to our leaders, back it up and say then these are the competencies that we need. Again, continue this conversation back at the office, back with your leadership, your team. There's some tools in your toolkit to help you start the discussion, but it should only be a starting point, right? And then make them your own, and grow the list of behaviors that might be attached to those competencies that you see in your handouts. Okay. This is, as I was preparing for this session, this was a quote that I found in the Harvard Business Review. Honestly, I'm sure most of you guys are online with the Harvard Business Review. I just, whenever I'm doing research, I'm thinking ideas, I just go on and I love to read their articles. It really grows my mind. So if you're ever looking for something to do and you're just wanting to think outside the box, Google it. And all of a sudden, great ideas come. So I always like to use that as a resource for myself to think outside the box. And so as I was preparing for this session, there was this thought and idea that was coming from the Harvard Business Review that I wanted to share with you. And we are competing directly with the private sector, and it's tough slugging. Not so much today because of the recession. Things are going to turn around though, right? And you know, hopefully in a year, we're going to find that our oil and gas sector are back hiring, and we're going to be competing at a different level again, right? But labor shortage hasn't gone away, right? So we're still competing. And we need to be thinking constantly about how do we do that as a sector, right? And getting focused on what's important to you, your competencies, is part of that thinking and part of that strategy. The reality is we will compete to a large extent, or I'd like to suggest that we will most successfully compete with the millennials, right? So we need to look at the younger generation, and the Harvard Business Review sort of confirmed that for me as I was doing my research. That was my gut. And so it was interesting that they said that really we need to challenge ourselves to attract talented young employees and then nurture their development. And that was mentioned in the presentations this morning as well. I've just been given the time watch, so I need to speed it up. But what, if you've been to some of these previous sessions that we've had in HR in a Box, you've heard us talk about the value proposition, right? So what I'd like to think, if we're competing for talent, think in terms of what's important to you, the competencies, right? But think in terms of your value proposition, because that's how you're going to be able to compete. From a sector perspective, what is it that you can offer in your organization that maybe the corporate world can't? And that's how you're going to compete. Our millennials that are coming, that are here with us in the workforce, they want a different experience. They want flexibility. They do want to give back. So you need to call out and think about your value proposition in order to be able to compete with those competencies. You'll never compete on dollars. So if you can't compete on dollars, how are you going to compete? So if you've been to previous sessions, pull out your notes on the value proposition and think about that, because that's how you're going to be able to track the competencies that you need to compete in the 21st century. we also, and Nicole alluded it today, in order to bring these competencies that we need into our workforce, we need to think out of the box. Maybe not today because of the way the recession is, but the labor shortage has not gone away. And when things pick up in the oil and gas industry, we're going to be back looking and beating the bush. And we want to make sure we bring the right talent in. We don't want somebody to come in just because they can't find a job in the oil and gas sector, right? We want people to come in who really are passionate about working in our sector. So you need to think big, broad, outside the box on what other sectors, what other industries might you look at to bring those competencies in. And Nicole, you're going to be having a session on that, so that's going to be a good think tank for that. So I'm glad to see that. And what we need to remember is we will recruit for the aptitude and the attitude, and we can always train for competencies. So I really think that's an opportunity when we look to other industries, right? Because we will maybe, we may not see the skill, the specific skill that we need, but we may see a real attitude and an aptitude to say, wow, if they came into our organization, we could provide them with what they're looking for, and they could do great things for us. So really thinking outside the box as to what that will look like in your organization. And then we don't have time because we're running out, but this is a good session. I have run out of time, right? So this is a good exercise to take back to your teams, right? And do some brainstorming around this. Do some table talk, do some lunch and learns, and talk about, that transferability of skills. And could we be looking at occupations in different sectors in order to say, is there a match for us? And again, having those discussions around competencies, what that, like could a store manager, have the competencies to be a leader within your organization? But again, you gotta think in terms of what competencies would they bring to the table, and do those competencies actually match what our environmental challenges are and what our leadership skills requirements are? So thinking in terms of that. Right now, actually, there's lots of opportunity here because there's lots of engineers out there that says, you know what, if I could change the sector I work in, I'd change it in a dime. Because you know what, I just don't know whether I can take another cyclical. People my age, they've been through it a number of times. And so they're looking to change sectors, right? So you need to think about, is that opportunity for our organization? These are some resources that I found as I was doing my research for the session today. You might want to click on it. And I just want to thank you. I've spoken at these sessions now a couple of times, and I just so enjoy the discussion and dialogue that we have. So thank you for bringing that to my career development and growth. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? I know that this is a complex topic, and thanks, Janet, for going granular on this, but don't waste the opportunity to ask anything that you want out of the panel. I happen to have a slightly different opinion when Janet talks about when the oil and gas is going to come back. And I don't want to be the naysayer in the room, but I really don't think it's going to the way it was.
No.
I really don't. And for one reason, first of all, the world is changing. Number two, the political will has changed. And we cannot simply think that, oh, okay, in 2 months, 3 months, we're going to be back to the heydays. It's just not going to happen.
But you know what, Nicole? We don't, and you know what? We won't have to, because what's happening in the sector is that the industries have become so efficient. They have become so efficient that they can operate on $60 a barrel.
Well, and that is where the transferability of skills and higher efficiency in the skill set and the competency is going to come in. To Janet's point about the questions on the slide preceding this one, if you go to the website of the talent pool on the homepage, you're going to see a study that we released about 2 months ago with a colleague partner organization where we did an analysis of transferability of skills between, from the oil and gas sector to the supply chain. And you're welcome to look at it, and you can see that, yes, it can happen. So the more we learn about this very difficult art and craft that we talked about today, the better off we'll be. Questions for Jeff? Dirk? Janet? No? Yes, there's a question coming there.
I'm not sure who it.
That's okay.
I'm not sure who it would best suit, but would you have any suggestions on methods on identifying the competencies? Like, and I'm thinking more like, can you recommend any questionnaires, or there are consultants that do testing, programs that test for different behaviors and competencies. I've done some of those in recruiting. Are there methods and practices that you could relate to competencies on that front? That's a pretty broad question.
That's a fair question.
Do you want the short answer or the long answer? One of the best resources when you're looking at your organization and doing this organizationally is the Competency Clearinghouse, Career One Stop. We'll get you the links. But the U.S. Department of Labor has spent a hockey sock full of money over the last 10 years working on this and talking about these modular stackable credentials and how they apply across multiple industries and multiple contexts. So as a starting point, that's where I would start, because they may actually have on that Career One Stop page a competency framework for the position or the occupational title that you're looking for, and then you can take that and modify from it. But that'll give you at least a place to start. There's any number of other resources that you can use, but that's one of the better ones.
Okay,
Can I just
thank
add
you.
to that too?
Yes.
Just on more of a strategic level, part of what we're doing now with organizations is we're doing, and you can either do this at an organizational level or at a departmental level, and actually that's going to be part of the work that you do on that Bringing It All Together workshop, is to do the SWOT analysis. And so part of your SWOT analysis, there's specific questions that you can ask that will actually drive out those competencies.
So there are methodologies available, and there are simple templates. We're going to probably do a follow-up to the session just because it is so broad and there is so much involved. But right now, I know that Jackie needs to share a couple of things that are of interest to all of you. And I want to remind everybody, we need your feedback survey questions. Please leave them on the table. Thanks to you, we have enough now for HR in a box 2 and 3. So you're driving this bus.